The Young and the Restless spoilers. In Genoa City, the truth always has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully someone tries to bury it beneath layers of loyalty, fear, or self-preservation. For Michael Baldwin, the illusion of distance had finally shattered. During a gathering at society, the pressure had mounted to the point where words escaped him before he could control them. His wife, Lauren Fenmore, had asked the question that lingered too long in the air, whether or not he was still in contact with Victor Newman, and in that brief moment of confrontation, all the tension of the past weeks collapsed into a single, reluctant confession. Yes, he admitted, he was still communicating with Victor, and yes, it was more complicated than he wished it to be. Lauren's face, already carrying the fatigue of too many sleepless nights, fell into a quiet devastation that only love can inflict. She wasn't merely hurt by the betrayal of secrecy. She was terrified by what it implied, that Michael had once again become entangled in Victor's endless web of manipulation, where every favor had a price and every act of loyalty led to another impossible demand. Lauren's concern was not unfounded. For years, she had watched her husband wear the mask of composure while secretly drowning in the expectations of those more powerful than himself. She knew that Victor's reach extended beyond business or politics. It was psychological, moral, even spiritual. He had a way of breaking men by making them feel indispensable. And Michael, despite all his brilliance and strength, had always been vulnerable to that lure, the feeling that only he could fix what others could not. What began as an occasional consultation had now evolved into something far more consuming. Victor's constant orders, veiled under words like favors or duties, had turned into a list of near-impossible assignments that drained Michael's energy and conscience alike. Lauren had seen the signs, the late-night phone calls, the half-written letters he burned before she could read them, the tremor in his hands after long conversations that never ended well. It wasn't just about business anymore, it was about control. When Nikki Newman entered the conversation that evening, her voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut through any pretense. She had seen the same thing happening from her perspective, the growing bond between Michael and Victor, which to the outside world looked like strategic partnership but was, in reality, a cycle of dependency. But Nikki went a step further. She mentioned something Lauren didn't know yet, Michael's recent contact with Kane Ashby. The room seemed to lose air for a second when she said it. Lauren's reaction was instant, her body stiffened, her lips parted in disbelief, and her gaze turned to her husband as though hoping she had misheard. But the silence that followed from Michael confirmed it all. Nikki's revelation wasn't malicious, it was necessary. She had overheard fragments of a conversation at Crimson Lights, one that Michael thought had been private, and the implications were damning. Lauren had long learned to live with the idea that her husband's work often involved complicated alliances, but Kane Ashby was another story entirely. His name alone carried the weight of too many scandals, betrayals, and unfinished business. He wasn't merely unpredictable, he was dangerous in a way that few in Genoa City truly understood. Once a man seeking redemption, now he appeared to have descended into darker motives masked behind polished charm and strategic precision. The revelation that Michael had been speaking with him, or worse, helping him, was enough to shake the foundation of Lauren's trust. Yet as the pieces began to fall into place, the true gravity of the situation became clearer. The threat that Kane represented was not imaginary. It was immediate, real, and personal. Michael knew it better than anyone, which was precisely why he had tried to keep it from Lauren. Kane had returned under a name that carried no trace of his past, Aristotle Dumas, a pseudonym he used during his time abroad. Under that identity, he had built connections with investors, data firms, and pharmaceutical channels that no one in Genoa City had the courage to touch. When the truth came out, Victor had seen an opportunity rather than a threat, instructing Michael to re-establish contact. The reasoning was that Kane could be useful, that through negotiation and subtle intimidation, Victor could control the chaos before it erupted. But in truth, it was Kane who had been controlling the board all along. Michael found himself standing at a moral crossroads that had no safe direction. His loyalty to Victor demanded silence, but his conscience and love for Lauren begged him to break away. Still, the lawyer in him knew that the moment he severed ties, Victor would destroy him politically and professionally, while Kane might interpret it as an act of betrayal that warranted retaliation. Genoa City had seen its share of rivalries, but this one was more insidious. It was not about company shares or corporate sabotage, it was about psychological domination, about proving who held real influence in a town where morality was often traded for survival. Lauren couldn't comprehend how her husband had gotten so deeply entangled again. She had thought he had learned from the past, from his manipulation at the hands of Victor, from the mental toll it had taken the last time. She could see the exhaustion behind his eyes, the quiet despair of a man who had convinced himself that serving a tyrant was somehow a noble sacrifice. Every time Michael promised her that this was the last favor, she wanted to believe him. But she had seen too many lasts to count. This time, it wasn't just about business ethics or legal boundaries, it was about safety. Kane had a way of smiling when he lied, of pretending empathy while dissecting someone's weaknesses. And now he had Michael exactly where he wanted him, between a powerful manipulator and a vengeful opportunist. Nikki's warning didn't stop there. She hinted that the conversation at Crimson Lights had been more than a mere exchange of words. Kane had proposed something, a partnership that blurred the lines between legality and coercion. Michael had declined, or at least claimed he had, but Kane's persistence suggested otherwise. If Kane was indeed positioning himself for revenge either against Lily Winters, who still refused to reconcile, or against those who had kept him from reclaiming his former power, then Michael was now an unwilling pawn in that dangerous game. And Victor, being Victor, would exploit every ounce of that connection to maintain control over both men. The name Lily Winters hung over the discussion like a ghost. Everyone knew that Kane's unresolved feelings for her were both his weakness and his weapon. The reconciliation he longed for was also the one thing that kept him unpredictable. If Lily continued to distance herself, Kane's frustration could twist into obsession, and when obsession took hold of him, destruction usually followed. Michael knew this too well. He had once represented Kane during one of his legal disputes, and he had seen that dangerous flicker in the man's eyes, the one that mixed love with vengeance until they became indistinguishable. That same energy was back now, amplified by time, resentment, and perhaps a new alliance that even Victor underestimated. As the night drew on, society became a stage for uneasy silence. Each of them, Lauren, Nikki, Victor, Michael, sat in the tension of unspoken fears. No one trusted anyone completely. Lauren's heartache was visible, Nikki's warning was lingering, and Victor's absence was louder than his presence. Somewhere in the shadows of Genoa City, Kane was already planning his next move, recruiting, watching, and waiting. His motives remained unclear to most, but to those who had dealt with him before, it was evident, Kane's threat wasn't random, it was calculated, deliberate, and deeply personal. He wanted to rebuild his empire, and if that meant using people like Michael as stepping stones, then so be it. For Michael, the burden had become unbearable. He knew he had to make a choice soon, either confess everything to Lauren and risk her wrath, or continue hiding behind partial truths until the damage became irreversible. He also understood that the fight ahead wasn't just about reputation, it was about survival. Victor was powerful, yes, but even he couldn't control what was coming if Kane's new identity fully merged with his past. Aristotle Dumas was not a businessman, he was a creation born from desperation, revenge, and reinvention. The longer Genoa City ignored that, the greater the explosion would be when his plans finally unfolded. Lauren's fears, Nikki's warnings, Victor's manipulations, and Kane's unpredictability, all of them converged into one dark, inevitable conclusion. The storm brewing in Genoa City was not one that could be stopped by reason. It would demand sacrifices, perhaps even losses. And at its center stood Michael Baldwin, a man torn between his conscience and his debt, his love and his fear. For years he had been the one cleaning up other people's messes. This time, he had become the mess himself. And as Kane's influence continued to creep closer into his life, the question was no longer whether Michael would fall, but how hard, and how many would fall with him when the truth finally detonated. Lauren Fenmore had always been guided by her heart, but in Genoa City, even the most honorable hearts could be deceived by good intentions. Her love for Michael Baldwin was unquestionable. It was the steady force that had anchored them through decades of triumphs and breakdowns, betrayals and forgiveness. Yet, in this new storm brewing around them, her instincts, though noble, were leading her into dangerous miscalculations. She had always seen herself as Michael's protector, the one who could sense when he was falling under the shadow of Victor Newman's manipulation. Her determination to shield him from that influence was righteous, but this time her assumptions were no longer aligned with the truth. She believed Victor was the primary danger, as he had always been. But what Lauren did not yet grasp was that the real threat now came from a much darker and less predictable source, Cain Ashby, whose ambition and resentment had evolved into something far more destructive than any corporate rivalry Genoa City had ever witnessed. Victor Newman was never a man to be trusted in matters of empathy. He was not known for compassion, even toward his most loyal allies. Despite decades of shared history, Victor viewed people as extensions of his will, tools to be used until they broke or became inconvenient. Michael had seen this firsthand, yet his sense of duty often overpowered his caution. What made it tragic was that Victor, after everything Michael had confided about his personal life, still failed to show the understanding that friendship demanded. Michael had opened up to him recently about his struggles, about feeling distant from his family, about the haunting memories of the Ian Ward incident at the Baldwin farm, and about his attempts to reconcile what it meant to be both a father and a man of justice. Instead of empathy, Victor had given him another mission, another justification cloaked in the language of loyalty. He believed that Michael's intellect and influence were irreplaceable in keeping order within Genoa City's fragile balance of power. But in reality, Victor's schemes had only dragged Michael further into a conflict that threatened to unravel everything he held dear. The danger this time was not just about reputation or business politics. It was existential. Cain Ashby, under his new guise and his revived ambitions, was no longer playing by the same rules. His vendetta had become a carefully designed operation that threatened to destabilize the very legacy of Genoa City. The city's oldest businesses, Newman Enterprises, Jabot Cosmetics, and Fenmore's itself, stood on the verge of a silent war that few could see but many would suffer from. Cain had learned from his years of humiliation and exile. He had studied the system, its weaknesses, its dependencies, and the fragile egos that ruled it. He wasn't coming back for redemption, he was coming back for conquest. He knew that targeting companies alone wasn't enough. To destroy an empire, one had to destroy the people who embodied its soul. And in that sense, Lauren Fenmore had unknowingly become one of his most strategic targets. Lauren's stance against Victor's influence made her admirable, but it also made her vulnerable. By opposing the Newman machine, she had exposed herself as a voice of moral defiance in a world that thrived on compromise. Cain saw this as an opportunity. Fenmore's, the company Lauren had fought so fiercely to preserve, represented not just a business empire but a legacy of elegance, independence, and resilience. If Cain could corrupt or collapse that symbol, it would send a message to every other family in Genoa City, that even those who stood for integrity were not beyond reach. Cain's methods were subtle. He didn't launch direct attacks, instead, he planted seeds of mistrust, weaponized whispers, and let fear do the rest. And as Michael became more entangled with Victor's operations, Cain's plan gained even more momentum. Lauren tried to rationalize her fear by focusing on Michael's potential to resist. She told herself that her husband was experienced, intelligent, and cautious enough to recognize danger when it approached. Yet, deep down, she knew that Michael's greatest strength, his ability to see good in complexity, was also his fatal flaw. He believed that even in a world of corruption, there was still room for redemption. That belief made him admirable, but it also made him exploitable. Cain understood that psychology well. By presenting himself as a man seeking a second chance, he had earned Michael's cautious curiosity. By feeding Victor fragments of information that seemed valuable, he had gained his partial trust. And through those two men, Cain was quietly building a bridge into Genoa City's inner circle, a bridge that he planned to burn as soon as it carried him far enough. Meanwhile, Victor, ever the strategist, recognized the potential in keeping Michael close. Despite his cold demeanor, he understood that Michael possessed something none of his other allies had, an unyielding combination of intellect, morality, and strategic instinct. He admired Michael's composure under pressure, his ability to read people without letting emotions cloud his judgment. It was precisely because of this that Victor kept him in his orbit, even as their relationship drifted between friendship and exploitation. What Victor failed to understand was that Michael's loyalty was not infinite. Beneath his professional demeanor, there was a man growing weary of being used as a weapon in other men's wars. It was during one of these tense encounters that Michael's hidden courage finally began to surface. When Jack Abbott introduced a counterproposal to one of Victor's latest schemes, Michael found himself in an unexpected position. He was no longer the silent enforcer or the cautious advisor, he was the voice of reason in a room full of egos. His arguments were sharp, his logic unassailable, and for the first time in years, even Victor paused to listen. The plan Jack had presented involved a delicate merger that could protect Jabot and Newman Enterprises from Kane's silent infiltration, but it required transparency and cooperation, two things Victor rarely tolerated. Yet Michael, with a steady hand and unwavering voice, made a case that was both pragmatic and moral. It wasn't about power, it was about survival. And in that moment, he ceased being a pawn in the game. He became something far more dangerous to men like Victor, a hero with clarity. His heroism wasn't defined by grand gestures or loud declarations. It was quiet, intellectual, and deeply human. It came from his ability to act against his own fear and to defend the truth even when surrounded by deceit. Lauren, watching from afar, sensed that transformation even before he did. The man she had feared was slipping away into darkness, was beginning to fight his way back toward light. But the cost of that redemption would be steep. The more Michael tried to dismantle Kane's influence, the more he realized how deeply it had already spread. Fenmore's name was being dragged into financial speculation, Newman's subsidiaries were facing unseen audits, and Jabot's upcoming product line had already been compromised by data leaks, all pointing back to one invisible source. Kane was not simply waging war on individuals, he was orchestrating a symphony of chaos designed to collapse the city's hierarchy from within. Lauren's love, though fierce, was now shadowed by fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that her family was next. Fenmore's reputation, her life's work, had become a chess piece in someone else's game. And yet, despite her anxiety, she refused to retreat. Her instincts as both a mother and a businesswoman told her that courage was the only shield left. The more the walls closed in, the more she realized that standing beside Michael wasn't just about loyalty, it was about survival. He needed her strength as much as she needed his resolve. Together, they were the last line of defense against an enemy who thrived in manipulation and shadows. But Genoa City was never kind to heroes. For every step Michael took toward justice, Kane anticipated two ahead. The tension was growing not only in boardrooms but in the very air of the city, a sense of impending reckoning that no one could quite define. Victor, for all his power, was beginning to sense that he had underestimated the danger. Jack, for all his optimism, was realizing that even his strategic brilliance could not contain what was coming. And through it all, Lauren stood at the heart of it, torn between love, fear, and a desperate desire to believe that her husband's integrity could still save them both. In the end, her heart remained pure, her faith unbroken, but her calculations, as sharp as they once were, had failed to predict the magnitude of what was unfolding. Kane's shadow stretched further than anyone imagined, reaching into the cracks of every foundation that Genoa City had been built upon. And as Michael Baldwin, once again transformed by the chaos around him, stepped into the light of reluctant heroism, the city braced for what was coming next, a storm that would not only test his courage but determine the future of every family bound to the name Genoa City itself.